Good afternoon. We are just letting everyone enter and then we'll get started in one moment. Thanks for being here this afternoon. Okay, I think we're going to jump in. We're sort of a minute past 2 and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. For those of you who are still joining, I think my overview will be such that you won't get lost, you won't miss much, but I want to, again, make sure we don't take more than the hour we had said we would take. So good afternoon. My name is Kate Tromble. I'm the Vice President for Federal Policy here at the Data Quality Campaign. Welcome to How Much Does It Cost? An analysis of best practices for statewide longitudinal data systems. By way of introduction, if you do not know the Data Quality Campaign, at DQC, we advocate to change the role of data to ensure that it works for everyone navigating their education workforce journeys. We focus on high quality, transparent, accurate, and timely data and the systems necessary to make that happen, such that students, parents, policymakers, everyone involved in education and workforce pathways world has what they need to make the right choices and the right policy changes that will help improve economic development and student success. Today, there has been, or at least this week here in DC, lots of conversation about funding, federal funding, funding freezes, many things related to not data systems specifically, but some of the supports, financial supports for those systems. It has been confusing, I am sure, for everyone. It's been a little chaotic to try and make sense of what's happening. We've heard from states have been contacting us fairly regularly to help them understand. I wish I had more clarity to provide to you about what is happening, what will happen with federal funding related to data systems and state data, but I do not at this point. But just to say, we appreciate that the context today in which we're talking about state data systems and the cost drivers of those systems is sitting in a context where there's a fair amount of confusion and about federal sources. But we are hoping to make this conversation a little more uplifting, a little more clear, because we're going to focus on the cost drivers, personnel, governance, infrastructure that go into creating a statewide longitudinal data systems. How do those costs break down? How do states cover them? What are the different streams that they use? And what does that allow a state to do? What kind of system are they able to build and impacts are they able to provide for communities and residents in the state? And fortunately for me, we have two of my favorite people talking about it who just happen to be experts as well in this subject matter, and they're going to walk us through today. Little bit of housekeeping before I introduce them. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that to put your questions in the chat. Excuse me, to put your questions in. Do not use the chat, use the Q&A. We're going to stop at different points throughout this webinar to take questions. So if you have one, please write it as soon as you have it, and we'll try and pull them instead of waiting all the way to the end. We'll pull them throughout the course of the hour. Okay. Now going to introductions. I'm going to start with Kate Akers. She's the Vice President for Policy Implementation and Best Practice at the Data Quality Campaign. Before joining DQC, Kate was the Associate Vice Chancellor and Chief Data Officer for Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, also known as PASHE. And prior to PASHE, Kate was the Executive Director at the Kentucky Center for Statistics, or KYSTATS. Her partner in crime today is Matt Berry. Dr. Matt Berry is Executive Director for the Kentucky Center of Statistics. Prior to taking the helm as ED, Matt served as KYSTATS Research Director. He's also served as the Chief Scholarship and Policy Officer and Director of Strategy and Impact at Evolve 502/55,000 degrees, and also on the Kentucky Council for Postsecondary Education. Matt has authored several peer-reviewed policy publications and served on numerous boards and committees at the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and he is solidly one of the leading experts on how you can best use a statewide data system to bring about change for students and workers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate and Matt.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. Matt and I are both so excited to be here. Matt, I'll just speak for you. So we're so excited to be here and to talk about this today. As Kate mentioned, my work here at the Data Quality Campaign is really focused on policy implementation and best practices, and really focusing on the how with state data leaders. So thinking about these leaders throughout the country, they're really looking to create meaningful impact, leveraging comprehensive multi-agency longitudinal data systems to really drive out meaningful change in their states. That can be really challenging if these offices are not funded to do this type of work. So today I'm really going to introduce you all to some of the research that we've done in this area. So thankful for the other states that participated in this work, that will highlight those in just a little bit. But we're really identifying some of these emerging best practices within this state longitudinal data system, P20W integrated data system ecosystem. And although I'm really excited about this work and sharing our findings with you, I think that really the most impactful piece for all of you will be the commentary by, of course, my fellow Kentuckian, Matt Berry. So Kentucky is seen as not only best in class in terms of, the actual Kentucky longitudinal data system itself, but even more so a leading state in terms of stakeholder engagement, sustainability, policy engagement, and really thinking about sustainable funding for the office. So as we kind of get down into this, this work really resonated with me, and I was so excited to dive in. The question of what does it cost continuously came up as one of the most identified question from states, external organizations, including the Data Quality Campaign, by the way, that we as a state would really have to grapple with. It was challenging for us to answer without saying it depends. So what's really exciting about this work is that we focused on some of the most mature, longstanding, and also upcoming systems to really better understand the impact of, as you can see here, the governance model, funding strategy, and really considerations that are really driving out some of these costs within the state. So it's very complementary to conversations that you all may also be having about, blending and braiding of federal funds. However, really what we're seeing is that these mature systems and up and coming systems are really using funding well beyond federal funding and really thinking about how it all fits together. So today we're really going to dive in across these three areas. We're going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning, kind of setting the stage. And then after each section, we would love to have questions from you all through that Q&A feature. All right, so let's get started. So I mentioned Kentucky, obviously. We also looked at 3 other state longitudinal data systems, including Maryland, Washington, and California. And then we are including information here just to let you know some basic information about the population of the state, which we think could have been a driver within cost, what the overall budget is, the number of employees and folks actively working on the system, as well as some more information about the actual system stack and the platforms, and then of course, governance structure. So we really brought together this information. I mentioned, what the driver really was for me, which was this was a very difficult question for me to answer, even in a state with actual state, line items, as well as very specific funding sources geared toward the state longitudinal data system. But we really wanted to examine, how much it really costs to set up systems, understand the cost structure, what was really driving the costs of these systems, and then really thinking about it from both an initial cost and ongoing. So we're able to see some of that in particular in California through their really thoughtful approach, thinking about really what is it taking to really get this system up and running, and then really what do those long-term ongoing costs look like, and how do those compare with some of these other mature systems that we're looking at. And then we also wanted to think about some challenges and cost variability, understanding more about the funding environment, which Kate mentioned earlier, and then also thinking about what does modernization look like, and what does that mean? What does it look like to expand these systems, integrate new technologies, and really make these systems work for the state? So we analyzed data from these 4 exemplar SLDS states. We conducted interviews, multiple interviews with representatives. We collected public data, including budget documents, and really tried to bring that information all together. And then really what clearly emerged was a set of best practices for states in these areas. So we're getting ready to go through each of these high-level areas, governance model, really understanding the relationship between the governance structures themselves and the overall funding of the system, the funding strategy, thinking about how states are really using multiple funding sources and how that has really evolved over time, understanding the impact of personnel and what that looks like, including what types of functions these offices are really using to be able to do this great work, and then really the underlying system stack. So what does the technology look like? What do those contracts look like? What is the overall cost that we're seeing? So before we dive down into the governance model, I guess any questions or about the overall overview before we dive in? And if not, we're excited just to go ahead and get started. All right, so let's go into the governance model. So this will be, I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview of what we see in other states. And then what I'm really excited about, as I mentioned earlier, is really hearing how this really looks in Kentucky. So how this work functions, and then what that overall impact is on how KYSTATS is funded. So here you'll see each of these columns represent the various states. They all have a relationship, of course, to the executive side within that state through the governor's office. Some are, administratively attached, so to speak, to different areas. So Kentucky, of course, being attached to education and labor, Maryland being attached for administrative services only to the Department of Education, the Education Research and Data Center in Washington being attached within the Office of Financial Management, and then also has a branch for the Forecasting and Research Division. And then California, the Cradle to Career System, being attached to the California Government Operations Agency. Now, what you'll see on here are some of the states are highlighted. So Kentucky, Maryland, and California. This highlights that this work, although these systems are attached to some sort of cabinet or agency, they are governed by an independent board. So I think that that's a really great way to kind of launch into hearing a little bit more about what that looks like in Kentucky.
Thanks, Kate. First of all, thanks to both the Kates, Kate Trumbull for the nice introduction, Kate Akers, always good to see you. And I'll just acknowledge right up front, a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about, Kate was around for and was sort of the driver of, so I'm just going to acknowledge that. I don't like to be that nice to her all the time, but I'll just go ahead and say it up front so we can get it out of the way. But I'm very happy to be here. Always love to be engaged with DQC and the important conversations you all help facilitate for us. And Kate, as you said, this is a week I think that's highlighted the importance of these kind of conversations. So thank you all for having me. Kate, I think to take a little bit of a, without going crazy deep, a little bit of a deeper dive on the way that we are structured here in Kentucky. I'll say right up front, kind of as a caveat to everything I say, these are things that have worked for us. Some of the things we have tried and try still don't work. And it certainly, I'm not going to suggest that this would translate to everyone. Every context, every state is different. So I just want to say that right up front too. I don't think this is prescriptive, but I will say a lot of what I'll talk about today are things that I think have been really foundational to whatever success that we have had into the sustainability. One of those, I think, is actually our governance structure. So you can see here kind of the general outline of the way we are governed. To give a little bit more detail to it, we are administratively attached, and this is written into statute, I should say. So I think that's another really important thing that I should mention right up front, is that this was designed or established in statute 2013. So it's very, very clear how we're governed. Certainly statutes can change, but it's pretty hard, right? That doesn't come at the whim of any individual or administration or the change of either of those two. So we are, as Kate mentioned, administratively attached to the Education and Labor Cabinet, which obviously provides for us a lot of resources and sort of backbone that we would not have as a relatively small agency. for ourselves, but it provides for us some independence, actually quite a bit of independence. So we're governed by the board, which of course includes the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Labor, also includes the Commissioner for the Department of Education, the President of the Council on Post-Secondary Education, which is our SHIO agency, the Cabinet for Health and Family Services Secretary, and the President and CEO of the Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority, or KIA, which is, they do more than this, but you can think of them basically as our state financial aid arm. And so those entities were written into statute to be our governing board. The way that we kind of think of ourselves in terms of our governance and our operation, we talk a lot about being nonpartisan and independent. The being reporting to that board allows us, I think, the freedom to operate as such, and sticking sort of to that operating mode over a decade plus now, I think has ingrained that into folks' minds, that you can expect sort of a certain type of engagement with KYSTATS, and that there is a respect and an understanding of our independent governance structure. And so when we get questions, and I can talk in more detail later, but when we get questions, as an example, from the legislature or the legislative staff when they're in session, I think in general, as a general rule, they understand that they're going to get an independent analysis. They're going to get a straightforward approach with data and information, and they're not going to get commentary on policy or quality of programming, et cetera. So I think that has been sort of an important way that we operate. I think that's been facilitated by our governance structure. So I think obviously those two things go hand in hand. That's probably pretty self-evident, but for us, just from a cultural perspective also, that's been super, super important.
Matt, that's really helpful, as we think about what that really looks like within Kentucky. And I really like your alignment there that really shows, how the governance structure, both the legislation as well as the makeup of the board, really adds to what I would call kind of stakeholder engagement and really credibility for the office. So KYSTATS is the agency, the group. Matt Berry is the person folks call when they have questions about education and workforce data and beyond. And then they know whenever they ask you the question, you will give them the answer, right? And just the data itself, not create a lot of stuff around it, but here's the data and the information that they can really use to make policy decisions. And I think that your relationships that you all have, not just with the governor's office or with the state legislature, but also with communities, and thinking about that when folks are writing grants, they come to KYSTATS, right, for questions about just general information about the state.
So Kate, I just want to add real quickly, because that's a super important point, and you made me think of something. Having established this cross-sector governance structure, I think what it did early on is it helped develop and understand a really clear set of demonstration points and an understanding of the value across those sectors of connecting and using data like this. So if you're in the Cabinet for Health and Family Services and you have an opportunity to discuss data with folks from the Department of Education or any other example from our board, what happens is you can start to see the value of that. And then I think over time, what that does is it builds an understanding that, well, we can't stop there. We shouldn't stop there. So to your point, over the years, we've built a data system that goes well beyond those agencies that I talked about, which are represented on the board. And so we have this massive system now that really is, cradle to career. Certainly we want more, and we're kind of in the process of going and getting more sources of data if possible. But it really starts there with the cross-sector governance, building the understanding of the value, and then sort of, I think, going after more, because that value has already been demonstrated.
Awesome. We did get a question over to the side, and I think that, Matt, this was very much sparked by your description of like what the governance structure really looks like in Kentucky. Now, for a state like Kentucky, because they have that legislation, it's clearly defined. It's actually very easy for DQC and for other groups to pull out this information. Matt, you all also do a really great job of putting all of your board minutes, everything that you have up on the website. It's always a really great resource, and something that we also used as a part of this study in particular. So for states that have this governance structure codified, that's much easier to capture. Where we are doing work right now, is thinking about how do we capture some of these more informal structures and then help to support those states that are really looking to move that work forward. So, to the question of kind of creating, maps and really better understanding what governance looks like. I think that those are always conversations that we're excited to have out in the field and then also with other organizations. So let's move just a little bit into thinking about funding strategy. So, although I appreciate your nod earlier, Matt, KYSTATS was always a very collaborative process. So you mentioned all of the board members, and they were certainly very active participants within these conversations. So, as we think about kind of how these systems are funded, how they begin in particular, we really found a spectrum. So this is really thinking about where they started out, each of these. So on the far left, you have just, fully grant funded. And at KYSTATS, that's certainly the case. Really using those federal SLDS funds in particular through our partnership with the Kentucky Department of Education. And then there's a hybrid approach that we're seeing. We see this in Maryland, as well as a little bit in Washington, really where there's some state funding, but they're also able to utilize various types of federal funding, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then finally, there's California in particular that is fully state funded. So they are not using federal grants to build out this system, to produce information and insights about California. And then thinking about, the strengths and the challenges within each of these models. So I would like to hear just a little bit, Matt, and I'm going to kind of ask you as we go through this section, we have a couple of slides that are going to go down, deep into some KYSTATS information, but just kind of your general thoughts about kind of where this began in Kentucky, thinking about this grant first model.
Yeah, I mean, I think the grant, that's a great way to say it, the grant first model. We've evolved over the 10 plus years that we've been doing it, just like I think probably most organizations do. So we have a much more diverse set of revenue streams or revenue mix now than what we used to have. In the early days, we were certainly at one point solely federally grantees. Now we've moved to a mix of federal grants, of multiple sources of federal grants, including some subcontracts. We have state appropriations, and we have fee for service project-based work that we do as well. So we have a pretty significant mix now. I do think that to think about that development of your revenue streams as an evolution or sort of a long-term strategic plan is probably the best way to do it. Where I see the value in starting this is relatively speaking, as a small and sort of manageable grant funded operation is that it brackets kind of what can be a really large and unwieldy project that can take way over a decade and still isn't done, right? So if it is grant funded, I think that that's really great because it sets for you a set of deliverables, a timeline, a budget, et cetera, right? I do think as a part of that, if that is your starting place, I do think that as a part of hopefully as a part of your grant application, but certainly as a part of your operating mode, I think you should be planning for what that mid and long-term revenue mix is. It's hard for anyone to think about, what your revenue needs 10 years in the future would be. But I do think that midterm planning around at least identification of additional revenue sources is super, super important. The last thing I would say, to that direct question until we get into the nitty gritty here is what I think is smart about starting with a either single or, just small number of federal or whatever grant sources is that it allows to do something I think is really important, or actually it demands that you do something which is important, which is to demonstrate value and output early. Right. It really kind of pushes you to do so. Right. I think sometimes what can happen is we get into processes of building these infrastructures or the governance models or the products themselves or all of it. And that takes a really long time and it's very messy and very complex and it really never stops. But in the early days, that can really become the work itself as opposed to let's make some early connections. Let's have some stakeholder engagement. Let's identify our processes and the products that we want to design and develop and execute. and let's have that done in a certain time period and in a certain way. That I think is really helpful, because then that gives you something to build on and learn from. So I think that is a real clear benefit to the model of starting with a again, relatively speaking, smaller grant or single funding source.
That's a great example. And really walking us through kind of what that process looks like. So you mentioned some of the what I would call early wins or key things that happened. So as we begin to kind of transition into this, is looking at federal and philanthropic funds in particular, but thinking just back to governance just a little bit, we had a question come in about really addressing the power dynamics related to governance, because it seems maybe on a chart like this, the governor's requests always come first, right? So can you give us just a 2-minute thought as to how KYSTATS prioritizes, and then maybe how that links into your governance board, and as well as funding, right? Funding sources in particular.
Yeah, that's a really good question. What I will say is that in my experience, at least, the way this looks kind of ebbs and flows. And so I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. But the reason that I think that matters is because the push and pull ebbs and flows, your governance infrastructure and your way of operating are super important, because you can rely on them during different periods. So there are certainly times where it is required of us as an agency which operates independently to educate folks on the way that we operate. And I don't mean that passive aggressively. Folks come in and they expect sort of a certain way of being and operating, and those can sometimes be uncomfortable conversations, candidly. But it's really incredibly important that that we remain true to our mission and the way that we are meant to operate. So conversations around review of our work, and I'm not saying this necessarily happens, but just to give an example, review of our data, or our commentary on the data, or review of a presentation that we're going to go give to the legislature, et cetera, et cetera. These can be conversations which can be a little tricky, but the best thing for us to do is, or that we are able to do, I should say, is we're able to point back to our statute, our governance structure, and then our, at this point, decade plus history of, hey, look, this is the way that we operate. We're happy to bring folks into the fold. We're happy to discuss this. We're happy to have open and transparent conversations, but we do have to kind of draw the line at certain types of interactions. And in my experience, at least, that's been understood. It's been respected. It's been valued. And I think that from groups and individuals who I think matter to the future of our agency, I think that's actually really respected. I think folks, I can think of several times where, just being in front of a legislative committee or task force, we are commended for our commitment to operating as sort of just giving the data and no commentary beyond what they can, helping them understand what we're presenting. So again, it ebbs and flows, but it boils down to having that governance and the infrastructure, and then being open to engaging new stakeholders or re-engaging stakeholders. It's just really a process that's never completed, and I think you just need to be expecting of and comfortable with uncomfortable conversations at times, and I think that's okay. In my experience, you can get through those moments.
Very well said. I would encourage folks to go back through, if they're really interested in this, and see some of those KYSTATS board meetings in particular, because I think some of those conversations come up there as well, and being able to hear what those kind of healthy dynamics, sometimes uncomfortable conversations really look like when you're really trying to prioritize and manage this type of work.
Yeah.
So Matt, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the federal side, thinking about the federal funding and the transition. And then we have a slide after this that really goes into the state funds, which is where I think you can really talk about, the transition of this work over time. So tell me just a little bit about this slide in particular, thinking about kind of how we can see this federal funding stack, just to kind of orient the audience to this. So starting in about 2006, then going through 2024, you'll see the federal grants at the top. These include, the SLDS grants coming from NCES. They include other grants that we see in other places, such as WDQI, the Workforce Data Quality Initiative, as well as some additional funding that I think KYSTATS has been able to leverage because they are able to kind of get a hold of this type of data and really work with these various stakeholders. But what's really interesting to me is like the diversity in all of these funding sources over time. And then also just to set you up, until about 2010, 2011, this work really stayed within the Kentucky Department of Education and was a part of really building out a very, very strong centralized student information system for the K-12, which is a huge part of course, KYSTATS. But that's the funding that you're seeing there really wasn't the start of KYSTATS. It was really about building out that Kentucky K-12 student information system. So tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing here, Matt.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing here is the story of, the role that all of these types of funding or all these funding sources have to play in the development of systems and infrastructures like this. I do not think that it can be done with any sole source of this funding. And I don't even mean that because of just the dollars. I don't just mean the physical capital that it takes. I mean, I think it really takes these types of funding injections and what they can promote and what they can allow. The diversity of that is super important. So, Kate, you did a good job, obviously, of describing kind of the evolution of the organization itself, or what became at that point the KSUS, and then now is KYSTATS. Really, though, I think there's a couple of things to look at here. You can see that the role of federal funds has been massively important to us over this time, right? It has been a large percentage of our operating budget. Almost over the entirety of our organization. That is changing in the next fiscal year. Excuse me. Actually, I should say this fiscal year. So that is changing. That is not. I'm not. That might sound like I'm complaining. I'm not. We knew that was happening, right? So, and in some ways, that I think is a really important part of the story of the importance of a funding mix like this, right? So to me, a massive part of what those federal funds were intended to do, this is sort of my simplified understanding of it and my version of it, were to develop the infrastructure, develop the systems and the processes, and then the projects and the areas of focus necessary to do the work that we have been doing, right? And so you can see that I think that there have been multiple rounds of injections of federal dollars through multiple grants. Primarily through the SLDS grant funds. Those had different areas of focus. I'm sure most of the folks on this call are aware of that, so I don't need to get too much into that. But each of those areas of focus really, I think, led us towards, whether it was infrastructure development, organizational development of new project focus or ways of working, all of those things helped establish who we are and how we do that. Those funds were massively important for us to design, implement, and then sort of prove the concept of each of those and to demonstrate the value of the work and the organization. Massively important. However, I don't think that would have been sufficient. Number one, it certainly wouldn't have been to only rely on those funds in the long term. Clearly, if you just look at this slide, and also if you listen to what I'm saying in terms of our next fiscal year's revenue mix, it would not have been sufficient to rely solely on those for in terms of sustainability, long-term sustainability. I think it was incumbent upon us, and I think we did a good job. And this was over multiple years, by the way. We did a very good job of setting the stage for new investment, larger, ramped up investment from the state, from other sources of grant funding or project-based funding, and then from cost recovery. So cost recovery, project-based cost recovery has sort of ebbed and flowed as a percentage of our operating budget. It's gotten larger and smaller. I think it will actually get larger moving forward for several reasons. I think it's time for us to do that. I think we've got lots of opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the really interesting story, one of the really interesting stories, because I've said the interesting story 4 times, so it's at least one of them, is this partnership between federal and state investment. Because for us in Kentucky, we have now shifted from primarily federally funded from those SLDS grants So moving forward, the largest share of our operating budget will come from state appropriations. And, and in this last round, in our last budget session, we asked for basically an offset, an increase in our state funding, which was a direct offset to the last year of our SLDS grant funding. We did that for a few reasons. Obviously, one, we wanted the offset just from the capital perspective, but also I think it gave us all in Kentucky, all the folks who have been around since the beginning of this, a real win, because I think that was at least a part of the vision in the beginning, which was, eventually we'll own this as Kentucky, from a funding perspective. So that I think has been really massive. Again, though, I still think it's important for us, and it will remain important for us to not rely solely on state funds. And I know you can see some more detail here about what our state funds will look like. We won't rely solely on that. And as sort of a last thing that I want to say about the role of the federal dollars is, I don't think, even though we have become a mature organization, our funding mix has shifted, and I think it's appropriate at this point. I don't think that moving forward, the role of federal dollars should be absent of what we do. So I think the injection of new types of federal dollars for new efforts, for revamping what we do, for new initiatives or infrastructure or tools, I think is really super important. So I don't think it goes away, or I hope it doesn't, but I just think it looks differently at certain points in time.
That's really helpful, Matt. I'm going to add just a little bit, basically answering some of the questions that have come up in the chat. So one was about, just receiving federal funds. Does that mean that you have to provide access to your data sets and data and information to the federal government? In general, that is not a grant requirement. So typically when states apply for these grants, they actually say what they're going to do. They're going to build out a high school feedback report. They're going to bring in these sources, but there's not requirements to actually allow access into the data, to my knowledge, across any of the grants that have been mentioning. And then the other question was really thinking about what would freezes in federal funding, that this could potentially really harm state data systems. And so I would just say that every state has prominent stakeholders. Some of those are more connected to the administration, and all states should really be engaging with those stakeholders to make the case for them. So that means that, just as Matt was saying, these systems really have to demonstrate that value proposition. Right? Why is this worthy of taking this, to the federal government to really advocate that these funding pieces continue? And Matt, I really like how you talk about, even though you're seeing this kind of this balancing out of the state funding, the object here is not to have a single source fund the system, but to really think about leveraging federal grants, leveraging philanthropy, leveraging maybe cost recovery, which I think, if you also wanted to touch on, as really ways that to make these systems really sustainable. So Matt, do you want to talk just a little bit about cost recovery? When we started pulling together this slide, and then we were talking to some of the other states that were also kind of thinking in this frame of mind, they were blown away by what's happening in Kentucky. So I think that it is fairly unique in terms of how this is really built up. I think that I do remember some of the first cost recovery, very small projects that we got back. And I remember kind of the excitement around that, and really how we were able to build out some additional connections. So you'll see that, we'll talk about Kentucky, but Maryland recently launched a cost recovery program. They've already seen an increase in the revenue from that, from $10,000 in the first year to $30,000 in the second year, which actually looks probably pretty consistent to what Kentucky was seeing when we really first started introducing that. And then, Washington State does not currently have this. They're not currently accepting cost recovery funds. However, they did receive legal approval to do so. And then also thinking about kind of the sheer number of requests that you all process every year.
Yeah, so I think cost recovery has been a part of the way we've worked for a long time. It's also the ability to operate in that way is also in our originating statute. So I think that's an important note. That we are empowered to do that. Yeah, so I mean, if you look at some of the numbers there, what's interesting to me is I think I mentioned something to the effect of like that our cost recovery it's ebbed and flowed and it's evolved over the years. Typically, the way that we've operated with cost recovery is, we see ourselves as having a public service mission, right? Our mission is to leverage data to inform policymakers, practitioners, and the public to make better decisions. So that's a big goal. But if the way that we have viewed cost recovery's role in our operations is if we are approached by an organization, individual, et cetera, to do work that we see as already having been funded. So whether it be through SLDS or state appropriations or some other grant, then we typically would not engage in cost recovery. So candidly speaking, at least in my time here, over the last, I guess, almost 5 years, is there have been engagements which I think we could have sought cost recovery if that was not the case. If we did not determine that we had already covered our costs through other sources. So I say that just to say I think that number could actually get bigger, and I think it will get bigger. I am not going to sit here and say that now my job is going to be more of a business development job. That's not where we're headed. But I do think there are lots of opportunities for us as an organization to work with, statewide nonprofits or school districts or, you name it, to provide for them, data evaluation, information research, which, they candidly often have a budget for. And we have in the past said, we don't really need that. And so there's lots and lots of room there. That's just sort of from the strategic objective. I think nuts and bolts, really what that means to me is we can engage in work that maybe we have either covered or haven't engaged in the past. So we can try some new things with new partners. I think that's really exciting. And, that will, I think, maybe even allow us to branch into new avenues. So for example, I think that we as an organization, and this could apply to most longitudinal data systems, I think we should be more actively and more fully involved in evaluation efforts around the state. So I'm not saying that we don't do that and we haven't done that, but I think that's an area where we can really grow. So, we're working with a significantly sized nonprofit and we're in discussions around some funding that they've just received to do a 3-year program. And, can't we be involved right from the very beginning on their evaluation efforts? I think absolutely. I think that's a market opportunity for us that we need to start exploring more significantly. So I think that's kind of one of the spaces that we're headed there. But again, it'll remain a part of our kind of the blended model here, which you see represented. And then you mentioned, I know, and I can see it on the slide, you mentioned our data requests. The data requests, I think I want to just highlight as a part of our success of our stakeholder engagement. So we are very much out in the wild, right? And I said I wouldn't do it, but I'll give you credit, Kate, for setting the stage early for that. We don't just sort of sit back in our office and wait for people to ask us for data. We are out all the time, everywhere, as it were. Well, as many places as we can be reasonably. So, you can kind of see. So last year we really made a big effort on a lot of stakeholder engagement. We did some new things. Really did some more targeted geographic engagements, and you could see. So we really targeted our Appalachian region, which is mostly the eastern and southeastern part of our state. And you can see that the number of data requests skyrocket from that region after those engagement efforts. So I think that's where a lot of it comes from. We have a really talented staff. We have one of the best to ever do it that does our data requests. So if you can find a magician like our Barrett Ross, then I think that's really helpful. But I can't really, I personally lucked into him, so I can't really give you any advice on how to find somebody like that. But it is a really important part of what we do, and it leads to to discussions around other bigger engagements too. So that's a really interesting part about some of our data requests is they often lead to other work, and then that can tie back into cost recovery efforts as well.
That's really helpful. And I think actually leads us right into some of our final pieces. So we're going to just spend just a few minutes within personnel, a few minutes within kind of the system stack as well. So just to make sure that we have time at the end for any additional questions. So Matt, what you were really describing is like the importance of what I would call the bottom row here. So the top row is what we're really thinking about in terms of just general like administrative structure. And I think that these felt, very true to my experience, both in Kentucky and in conversations with other states, that these are the kind of buckets of personnel that you all have. And so thinking about kind of the leadership, the project management, the communications, however, the bulk of the actual personnel within KYSTATS and many of these other systems are within data management, system support, IT, and analytics. And I will just flag that all 4 of these states that we looked at actually build their systems in-house. So we'll see that actually when you look at the system stack, it's incredibly apparent, but the costs related to actually, the people working, bringing the data together, analyzing the data, creating data visualizations and reports are all a part of KYSTATS. And we actually see that within these other more mature systems as well. So just a little bit kind of here, Matt, you already talked about kind of the role of having somebody that really knows the data to really be able to pull data and information efficiently. But kind of tell us a little bit about some of these roles within KYSTATS and kind of how this comes together.
Sure. I mean, I think the takeaway here is something similar to what you just said, Kate, which is I think it's important to structure these longitudinal data systems and the organizations that run them with diverse sets of expertise, right? So we have our teams that we have a research team, a development team, a business team, which they do everything from contract negotiation to proofreading our reports. And we have a labor market information office, which is not really part of our conversation today, but is a really important part of what we do. So I just want to acknowledge that. But we have it broken down in those ways. What I think is really super important, and I know you want to kind of move on to some more of the specifics, but what I think is important is the diversity of those skill sets working together to bring a complex system like this beyond, an IT project. It is an IT project, and that's super important, but it can't, in my opinion, it can't remain that. So allowing for these diverse sets of skills, I think brings it into a larger scale project that I think you see in our organization, or at least I hope you do.
And I think that that's a really important part. I would continuously say, and I still say, I would actually say like an SLDS is not an IT project, but it has to drive actually that work that needs to happen in IT to move it forward. So I think that you've done a great job at KYSTATS and really elevating those conversations, really letting KYSTATS be known as like a think tank, for example, not just a database where all the data goes. So I think that that's really, really evident. And I think that that's also very true, of the kind of makeup of the office itself. We're not going to go into a lot of details about additional details about staffing, but I should have kind of nodded to this earlier. Your budget for FY25, just kind of we're not going to go back to that slide, but thinking about it, 85% of that budget is personnel. And that's very consistent, that, what we were seeing in other states. So when you're looking at kind of this slide right here, this is the bulk of the actual cost that KYSTATS is experiencing. Some of the other things are like, rent and utilities, travel, things like that. But the personnel is really where KYSTATS and some of these other mature systems as well are really spending their money. And so because we're running out of time, we're going to just quickly touch on the system stack in particular. So keep going. We have 2 states in particular that have all of the details like readily available about their system stack. And so I think the question that I would really ask you, please do not go through the details of why you all use each of these. You'll see that these are very complementary, different products on each side, but really just understanding the actual cost. But what I'm curious about is kind of when you think about the next step for KYSTATS, or you don't have to define what modernization means to you, but thinking about what are you thinking about in terms of additional funding, though, as you look to maybe modernize or think differently about your current system stack?
Yeah, so we are having conversations and thinking about modernization. What that exactly is going to mean is yet to be determined. But I will tell you that the questions around that, you can see represented in these lines here, right? So just the very first line, and I'm not going to go through these. If you look at Tableau, well, that's been the primary way that we have told the story of our data for years and years and years, and it's still really effective. I'm not going to sit here and tell you we're not going to use Tableau. But what I'm telling you is that we're having conversations around, are there other ways in addition to Tableau? How can we leverage the tools and the infrastructure that we have developed to the greatest impact and the greatest effect relative to our mission and what we're charged to do? So that is a big, broad, all-encompassing thing. We're starting really difficult conversations that I feel really ill-equipped to deal with, and around AI. We almost went a whole panel without using that terminology, but I had to throw it in at the end there. What parts that have not been cloud-based should move to cloud. So we're really looking at all of it. I will say that we probably are due for a real thorough review around for modernization in general as an organization. We're kind of going through that right now.
That's really helpful. Well, Matt, I want to thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us today and thinking about this. So we've really talked about governance models, funding strategies, personnel, and even just a little bit into thinking about system stack. And of course, the mention of the role of AI. So we're so excited to see the next steps for KYSTATS. So for those of you that are on here, Matt is certainly an expert in this field. I'm not an expert, but I'm very interested and I love to talk about it. And so if you're thinking about what this looks like in your state or a state that you're working with and are curious about maybe who is doing this type of work within your state, we would love to talk with you. So I'm going to pass that back over to my wonderful colleague, Kate Trumbull, to talk about next steps and some additional resources.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Matt, so much for the time today and everyone else for spending the last hour talking about costs related to statewide longitudinal data systems. Maybe not always the most exciting mid-afternoon topic of conversation, but it's such an important one given the impact these systems can have on driving economic mobility, academic success, understanding labor markets. So just a few quick things to follow up with. There are some DQC and other partner resources that might be helpful in terms of understanding the funding. So this is what is the cost. Our friends at the Multi-State Data Collaborative are having a webinar around sort of how to blend and braid federal dollars to pay for systems. And you'll see the field guide referenced here. That's the topic of their webinar. I think they're going to make it available as a recording after the fact, but there are resources that are available if you're trying to think about, now that you know what your cost drivers are, where do you find the various funds or streams of dollars. We've also got a very brief overview that DQC has done that sort of says where there are federal sources. Now, granted, things seem to be changing and a little less sure that some of those sources will continue. So was very appreciative, Matt, of your giving the evolution of KYSTATS and how you have gone to more diversified funding streams, be they cost recovery or state budget and appropriation line items as well. So these resources are available on our various websites. We will send them in an email follow-up. We also send a recording of this conversation in email follow-up so that you have it if you want to dive in further. And I believe we also have Matt and Kate's contact information that will be included. So thank you very much today for joining us. There we go. And I'll send those in the follow-up email should you want to get in touch with Kate or Matt after this. But thank you. We appreciate you joining us and we look forward to seeing you in the future.